Hello and thank you for joining us again on this fourth episode of our look at the Northumberland castles and look at the weather yet again. Fantastic. In this section we'll be visiting the castles which lie across the central belt of Northumberland, and we begin here in the far west of the county in Otterburn. Of course, we visited Otterburn last year in the Rural Northumberland film, which you might remember. And the castle is situated in the Redesdale Valley, about 17 miles east of the border with Scotland. And of course, you'll also remember that the town of Otterburn gets its name because of the colony of otters which populated the river here. Back in 1076, the whole of Redesdale was given to Robert de Umfraville for his support given to William the Conqueror on condition he kept the Scots at bay. As we already know from the last episode, the same de Umfraville family were also given Harbottle Castle a century later by Henry II. Harbottle is just 15 miles north of here as the crow flies over the Otterburn moors. Historical documents suggest a peel tower was built here around 1245, and the present tower stands on the foundations of that original. In August of 1388, the Battle of Otterburn took place as part of the border skirmishes between the English and the Scots. If you recall from our last episode when we visited Alnwick, it was around this time that the Neville family and the Percys at Alnwick were at odds with each other, which left the border defences weakened. The Scottish noble James II, Earl of Douglas, saw the opportunity to invade northern England and raided Durham and Newcastle before heading back north to Otterburn to await Lord Percy in battle. Douglas failed to take Otterburn Tower as it was too strong and built amongst marshy land. The fight was long and his troops became fatigued, so they retreated and requested a return across the border. Douglas refused because he was determined to take the tower, and so they set up camp for the night. Harry the Hotspur from Alnwick, otherwise known as Sir Henry Percy, marched his exhausted troops north from his battle with the Nevilles, outnumbering the Scots 3-1. Percy was so confident of victory, he sprung a surprise attack on the encamped Scots, with most of his army still marching up from Newcastle. Douglas was killed, but this went unnoticed until much later in the battle. The bulk of the Scots army had time to muster and then outflanked the English. Lord Percy was then captured along with over 1,000 soldiers, and in total 1,860 were killed. Nothing of any significance happened here for the next 300 years until the Jacobite rebellion of 1715, but the castle came into the Hall family around 1500. So why is the Hall family significant? Well, one of Otterburn's most colourful owners was Mad Jack Hall, who was a participant in the Jacobite rebellion. He was captured and executed at Tyburn in 1716. In 1844, the castle was sold to Thomas James, who built the current buildings over the original castle. Otterburn has seen some very famous guests, such as Sir Walter Scott, whose poem Rokeby was written here. The 1940s saw the castle converted into a hotel and popular wedding venue. Since then it has seen many owners, including the Scottish and Newcastle breweries, and today has a Malaysian owner. Hello again, and we're here in a hamlet called Akeld, just a mile or so along the A697 north of Wooler. We've talked a lot about the border reivers so far and fortified manor houses. So although this isn't a castle or a tower house, I just wanted to show you this. It's a bastle house. Bastle is from the French word Bastille, and a bastle house was a fortified manor house. We'll go up and take a closer look at it in a minute. But the hierarchy was as such. If you were a lord or a baron or an earl, you had a castle. If you were just wealthy, you built yourself a peel tower. If you weren't wealthy, then you built a bastle house. And if you were poor, you lived in a timber house with a straw thatch roof, and you probably perished at the hands of the reivers. The ground floor would house valuable livestock. The first floor would be living quarters, and the eaves would be sleeping quarters. Access to the first floor was only via an external ladder, which would be withdrawn for safety overnight. After the reivers' reign of terror was over, most of these bastles were fitted with an external stone staircase like this one here at Akeld. This is another bastle house. This one's situated right on the very west boundary of Northumberland, not far from Otterburn, but closer to Kielder. As you can see, it's pretty bleak up here, and this would have been the only way a family could protect themselves from the border reivers, or the raiders as you might wish to call them, and if you didn't have a stronghold like this, then you were at their mercy. This upper doorway would have been the doorway to the living quarters, and as I've already said, on an evening the ladder to access that door would have been withdrawn for safety. The door on the right in the gable end would have been the original doorway to the lower floor where the livestock were kept. The doorway to the left that you can see just in front of the stone stairway would have been added at a later point after the reivers had finished their escapades and relative peace presided over England. And I guess that would be the point where the door in the gable end would have been bricked up and the other one used in preference. The living quarters would have been on the first floor, and because this is quite a small one, the sleeping quarters would have either been in the eaves of the roof or on that same first floor. But you'll notice no windows apart from this little square one here, and on the other side a narrow slit type window, purely because windows meant that intruders could break in. On this side of the building, no windows whatsoever. One tiny opening on this gable end, probably for ventilation for the cattle inside. And you can see here where the roof timbers were adjoining the wall. And if you look over to the gable end, it certainly did have 3 floors, but that top sleeping quarters would have literally been very low ceilings and an attic, and you can see in the gable end there where the roof trusses, floor timbers would have been situated in the wall. Down below, the lid off the cattle's vaulted area has gone. I mean, someone's put a dividing wall in there, but that wouldn't have been there originally. That would have just been one very large space where you kept your cattle away from the raiders. Just like we saw in Horsley, here are the recesses in the stone doorway to barricade the door, just in case the raiders or reivers came equipped with a ladder. This barricaded the door from the inside. You can also see on this side how thick the walls are. I mean, that has to be at least a metre. And it must have been pretty scary to have been shut in here with reivers outside shouting, screaming and trying to gain access. It must have been pretty scary stuff. Life, I think, in medieval times was incredibly tough. You know, I mean, you never knew from one day to the next whether you were going to live or not. But living up here on the moors, and I mean, you can sort of see the sky behind me, there's not a cloud in it, and believe it or not, it's about 30 degrees and we're in September up here. But normally these moorlands between Otterburn and the border are pretty bleak, to say the least, so it must have been incredibly tough to live here, really bad. Hello, and today we are at Morpeth Castle. Morpeth is in the centre of Northumberland and where the county council is based, so pretty much regarded as the main market town here in Northumberland. And you'll remember we visited it last year in the rural Northumberland video. The castle was built as a motte and bailey in 1095 on a raised area of ground just behind the gatehouse that you see here. You can see here a perfect shaped motte, almost exactly as you see them in the diagrams, and the site of the original timber tower that would have sat on the top of this motte, and as we know, that's a derivative of a French word meaning mound. And it was as part of the Norman expansion into northern England in a bid to control the borders. In the same year it was built, it was captured by William Rufus, the youngest son of William the Conqueror, in his campaign against Robert de Mowbray, Earl of Northumberland. The Earl had started a rebellion against William, not being happy with his rule, and we mentioned this in the Bamborough video in the coastal episode. In 1138, the castle was owned by a Ranulph de Merley, who founded Newminster Abbey in Morpeth and invited Saint Robert from Fountains Abbey in Durham to be the abbot here. In 1199, King John the youngest and favoured son of Henry II ascended the throne of England. John was named Lackland by his father, as he lacked any lands of his own. So when Henry left him a substantial legacy, John's older brothers and Henry's wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, began the rebellion of 1173. John's reign was therefore troubled from the start, and quarrels with the Pope led to his excommunication. John managed to reconcile the Pope, but remained unpopular with the barons of the north, one of which was de Merley. The barons drew up the Magna Carta, the Great Charter of Freedoms, in June of 1215 and forced John to sign it. Neither side kept their promises, and the Magna Carta failed after just 3 months. King John marched his army north and attacked the barons and destroyed Morpeth and Mitford castles that same year and confiscated the lands. In 1218, Henry III had ascended the throne and gave the land back to the de Merlys, who built a second stone castle on the south side of the hill. In 1270, the castle passed to the Greystoke family through marriage, and it was William Greystoke who built the gatehouse that we can see behind us here. Morpeth Castle hasn't had much impact on Northumberland's history, apart from the events we've mentioned already. The only other significant incident was in 1644 during the First Civil War. 2,700 men, led by the Marquis of Montrose, besieged the castle for 20 days but failed to take it as it was so strong. In the late 1600s, the castle passed through marriage to William Howard of Naworth Castle near Carlisle, and his descendants still own the barony for Morpeth. Not much is left of the original castle, just pieces of the original curtain wall that you can see there behind me. The site, however, is managed by the Landmark Trust, and the gatehouse that you can see behind me is available to book as holiday accommodation. Before the Norman invasion of 1066, Mitford was a simple motte and bailey structure owned by John de Mitford, a knight to King Harold. His only daughter and heiress, Sibylla, was given in marriage to Richard Bertram, a Norman knight, in 1070. Bertram extended the bailey into an earthwork fortress, and then the motte was topped with a D-shaped wooden palisade. Around 1138, the castle passed to William Bertram, and Mitford Castle was rebuilt. A stone tower replaced the motte, and a curtain wall built around the south side of the bailey. In 1215, Mitford was owned by Roger Bertram, who was in league with the northern barons opposed to King John. After the failure of the Magna Carta to secure peace, John retaliated against the barons of the north, and civil war broke out, known as the First Barons' War. King John marched north with a large army and captured Mitford and Morpeth castles, and the lands were given to Philip de Ulcoats. Ulcoats garrisoned the castle for the king, but in 1216, when John died from dysentery, it prompted Alexander II of Scotland to invade northern England with the support of the barons. Mitford withstood a siege by the Scots. However, when John's son Henry III took the throne, Ulcoats was ordered to give Mitford back to Bertram. In 1264, Henry gave Mitford to his half-brother William de Valence, but in 1310 Mitford was seized by Gilbert Middleton of Belsay Castle, and we'll hear more about that when we visit Belsay. He used it as a prison for high-profile figures he'd kidnapped, such as the Bishop of Durham. Middleton was seized and taken to the Tower of London and later executed for treason. And as I say, we'll hear more about that when we visit Belsay. During Middleton's imprisonment in 1318, Robert the Bruce completely destroyed this castle during one of his raids into northern England, following his victory at Bannockburn 4 years earlier. Mitford Castle was never rebuilt. When James VI of Scotland became James I of England after Elizabeth I's death in 1603, stone from the castle was used to build a Jacobean manor house here. The estate and castle was purchased in 1993 by Bruce Shepherd, a wealthy businessman of Shepherd Offshore Limited, and it is still owned by him today. Hello, and here we are at Ponteland, small village about 9–10 miles west of Newcastle. Richard Bertram inherited the nearby castle at Mitford through a marriage arranged by William the Conqueror shortly after 1066, and part of that estate included Ponteland. Bertram built what was called a capital messuage on this site. Messuage or messuage, translated from the French, means manor house with outbuildings and land surrounded by a wall. There was also a church and a courtroom adjacent to it. In 1262, the Bertrams granted it to William de Valence, the first Earl of Pembroke in Wales. Valence was a French nobleman who became an English knight. He was an aide and close advisor to King Henry III and related to him through marriage. It is thought that it was Valence who added a peel tower on the site to protect from Scottish incursion, and he died in 1296. In 1324, the Ponteland and Mitford estates passed by marriage to David II, Earl of Athol. He had been banished from his estate in Athol in Scotland by Robert the Bruce for supporting the English King Edward II, who of course was Edward the Longshank's son. David's wife was a descendant of the Valence family and was granted lands in Kent and Northumberland for his support. He was also appointed constable responsible for the area. In 1388, Ponteland Castle was destroyed by the Earl of Douglas on his way back from Newcastle before the Battle of Otterburn, as we heard earlier. The castle lay in ruins then until 1597, when a Mark Errington inherited it through marriage to Margaret, heiress of the Mitford estate. Errington was the son of Gilbert Errington and Dorothy Delaval of Seaton Delaval Hall. He restored the ground floor and first floor of the tower and it remained in his family for the next 200 years. After his death in 1637, it became an eating place and Jacobean manor house. The publican tenants allowed the remains of the castle to rot away, and for a period it lay ruined without a roof. In 1935 it was restored by Robert Duker Limited into an inn known as the Blackbird Inn today. This is called the Vicar's Peel Tower, and it's situated on the main street in Ponteland, but not to be confused with Ponteland Castle, which is about 200 yards away around the corner. It was built somewhere between the 13th and 15th century. The exact date is unclear. And it was originally built as a hall, as you can see from the diagram, and then a peel tower was added probably in the 15th century. Why add a peel tower? Well, of course, two reasons: either the Scots or the Border Reivers. It was sort of expanded in the 18th century, but by 1860 it had fallen into disrepair and was demolished. The tower remained, and in 2000 it became a registered ancient monument and is preserved, as you can see here. Hello, and here we are on another fine day here in Northumberland, and today we are at Belsay, a few miles west of Ponteland, just off the A696, which is the main road to Scotland between Newcastle and Jedburgh. Before you panic, the castle is up there in the top left of your picture, but I promise you this is not a repeat of Cartington. We'll be going in shortly to have a closer look. It's just taking the large equipment in is not suitable today. The first fortification at Belsay was an Iron Age hill fort. All we know is that it had double ramparts and a ditch around it. Nothing else is known. Belsay was originally known as Belshew, and in 1270 records show a Richard de Middleton owning a manor here until 1317. He was the Chancellor to Henry III. After the Scots won the Battle of Bannockburn, northern England was left weak and open to attack. Robert the Bruce took advantage of this and repeatedly invaded northern England, forcing families in Redesdale and Tynedale to switch allegiance and side with the Scots. In 1317, Gilbert de Middleton became the owner of Belsay, and he raised an army to oppose Bruce. Adam de Swinburne was related to Gilbert on his mother's side and was the sheriff of the Marches in Northumberland. Swinburne told the weak King Edward II that families had fled Northumberland fearing the Scottish raids, and that the county lay desolate, inhabited only by wild animals. Edward took his criticism personally and had Swinburne arrested. It is believed that it was Swinburne's imprisonment that prompted Gilbert to switch allegiance and fight against King Edward. Gilbert extorted money from the Bishop of Durham to fund his attack on the king, and imprisoned the bishop at Mitford Castle, which we heard about when we visited there earlier. He managed to raid Yorkshire before being captured, and he was hung, drawn and quartered for treason, and Belsay was confiscated. Eventually the manor house was returned to John Middleton in 1391, who raised it as a castle with a 3-storey peel tower adjacent to the manor house. In 1614, Thomas Middleton replaced the original manor house with a Jacobean-style manor and walled gardens. In 1795, Sir Charles Monk inherited the castle. He was a Middleton, but took his grandfather's name of Monk. He built a new mansion house in a Greek style inspired by his travels on the continent. Belsay Castle was left unoccupied and quickly fell into disrepair. In 1872, Arthur Middleton became the owner and set about restoring the castle. During the Second World War, it was occupied by the military, and although it was handed back to the Middleton family in 1945, they lacked the funds to maintain it. In 1980, Belsay passed into state ownership, and today it is managed by English Heritage. Hi again, we're here on the top of the castle, and can I apologise for the sound quality at the moment. We're having to use a small handheld camera inside the castle, as the large equipment isn't easy to carry around. I'm on the roof of the castle here at the moment, and as we've seen, the floors below are typical of what you would see in a tower, and this is pretty much as it would have been when the castle was built or the tower was built. So as you can see here, the large vaulted lower floor, then we have the great hall, the living quarters, and you can see this is quite extensive. And then here we have the upper floors where the sleeping quarters would have been. And of course all floors were accessed with a spiral staircase. You can see here the maculations where oil or boiling water could be poured on intruders. As you can see here, all the stone that the castle was built with came from a quarry on the estate. So when you come to visit, you will actually walk through the quarry gardens to get to the castle, and you'll see they're quite extensive. So, I mean, a massive amount of stone was extracted to build this, the manor house, and of course the hall. You can also see here the cuttings into the stone where the stonemasons would have literally cut the blocks out of the quarry face. Hello again, and here we are on another fantastic day here in Northumberland in a small hamlet called Cockle Park on the outskirts of Morpeth, where the A1 annoyingly becomes a single carriageway. The name Cockle was the name of a Norman family who came to Britain after the invasion and comes from an ancient Anglo-Norman word, Cockrell, a town in Normandy. Cockle Park Castle is a rather grand peel tower, 3 stories high, built in an L shape, thought to have been built around 1520 as a hunting lodge. The first records show the 4th Lord Robert Ogle giving the lands to his brother William in 1517. The tower was later extended with the addition of a domestic building in the late 1500s, and the tower became part of the Bothell estate, whose owners had become the Dukes of Portland. We'll actually be hearing more on Bothell at the end of this particular episode, so more on that later. But here at Cockle Park, one end of the tower has 2 bartizans which are maculated. A bartizan is an overhanging wall-mounted turret with arrow slits, and maculation refers to the holes to allow boiling oil or rocks to be dropped on intruders. And Cockle Park is the only example that I have found to have this in Northumberland, so it's quite a special building. Despite these elaborate defensive fortifications, there's little written or recorded about any significant battles or skirmishes here, though it is obvious from what we know already about the border reivers, or raiders if you want to call them that, that the troubles of that period would have dictated the need for a tower like this. There is mention of the tower being garrisoned in the Second English Civil War in 1648 by George Monk, the founder of the New Model Army based in Coldstream, and his deputy, who was Oliver Cromwell, no less. In 1872, the Duke of Portland removed most of the furnishings and fittings and took them to Bothell Castle. Cockle Park became an experimental farm, and in 1902 was sold to Northumberland County Council and then to Newcastle University. The university still own it and run it today. And the university is planning to use it as a base to develop renewable energy from the land. Well, need I say any more? Another fantastic day here in Northumberland. And today we are in Bothell. And this is the last castle of this particular episode. This particular castle is privately owned, and tenants are actually living here, so we can't go inside it, but we have been given kind permission to film in the grounds. Bothell is a small village on the road between Morpeth and Ashington in Northumberland. Bothell was originally known as Bottle, meaning a dwelling, and most likely a hall of some kind in a Motte and Bailey type construction. It was rebuilt more than once and fortified before 1066. In 1095 it was given to Guy de Balliol, a baron from Picardy in France, by William Rufus, who you'll remember was the youngest son of William the Conqueror. Balliol's heiress and daughter Alice married William Bertram of Mitford, and the land became part of the Mitford estate. In 1343, several generations later, Sir Robert Bertram was given permission to turn the fortified manor house into a castle, including a gatehouse and curtain wall. After Bertram's death in 1362, his daughter Helen married Robert Ogle, and the castle passed into the Ogle family, a prominent baronial family, later to acquire Coupland Castle, which we talked about in the very first episode. In 1405, Roberts gave the castle to his youngest son, John, and he changed his name to Bertram to continue the Bertram legacy. After Robert Ogle's death in 1410, John's older, jealous brother marched on the castle with 200 men, and after a 4-day siege took the castle. By 1591, the castle and the estate passed to the Cavendish family, the Dukes of Portland, through marriage. During the 1600s, Bothell appears to have passed through several owners, but eventually ending up back with the Cavendish family, but in a ruined state. Restoration was carried out during the 1800s, but the castle seen today was rebuilt within the last 100 years. It is privately owned, as I said at the beginning, and it's not open to the public. As I said, we've been very privileged to have been allowed in today, so we can include it in our series. Well, that concludes this 4th episode looking at the castles of central Northumberland, and thank you for watching. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe to the channel. It helps the film to be enjoyed by more people. And don't forget to click on that notification bell icon that will inform you of any new releases. Next, we're off south to look at the castles in the Tyne Valley, so please join us for that.